The separation of talent and skill is one of the greatest misunderstood concepts. There's no easy way around it. No matter how talented you are, your talent is going to fail you if you're not skilled.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Skill Science. I'm here joined by PD Webb as always. Today is a very interesting topic of OG Anunoby and how do you develop these pathways of fluidity and what really is athleticism. He's a player who kind of by your standard understanding of athleticism, great leaper, great dunker, but this dude used to turn like a boat where it was like the Titanic trying to avoid a big iceberg, extremely slow, unable to get around corners. But now when you watch him, completely different player, and he's arguably the pinnacle example for a player on the wing who's really turned into that on-ball creator. And so we're going to talk kind of more about how he went from where he used to be in his early days and to where he is now developmentally. And so, PD, first off, how you doing? And secondly, kind of give me your initial thoughts on the topic.
I'm doing wonderful. We're talking about, I think, my favorite topic in terms of how to discuss a handle, how to discuss movement, how to discuss adding things into your a broad creation bag, which is I think one of the more mystical elements of basketball. It's one of the things that I think feels the easiest, but actually developing it maybe the hardest. I think that OG was a guy that I'd never thought was going to be able to ISO ever. When you watched him in Indiana, the idea was that he attacked downhill. He would, if he got two steps, he could, touch the top of the square. But if you were trying to force him to do more than a Euro step, he didn't have the ability to control himself. The same athlete did not show up in a zigzag pattern that would show up in straight lines. And after an ACL tear his sophomore year, which hurt his draft stock quite a bit for, I think, more just a confusion reason of NBA teams not having an understanding of what happened. I think his medicals were passed out late. We see a guy who year after year has been less of a dependent talent needing hard closeouts or transition or putbacks to score, but a player who is self-creating. And when he came into the league, his overall assist percentage was 82%, which is really, really poor for a 3. And now we're in year 5, and it is about 59% assisted, which would give him in the top 3/4 of the league for overall wings. And this isn't just this is not just a rim percentage thing. Every single area, whether it is the rim makes, the mid-range pull-ups, or the shooting off the dribble, which is, again, another phenomenal development for OG from 3. These are all developments that come from his increased mobility, his increased fluidity, and his just general ability to go get his own shot in a way that was not present at any point prior to the last 2 or 3 years of the Raptors.
Yeah, I think when I saw him play, I thought of him, he's a limited pathway athlete, meaning he's very athletic in very kind of controlled avenues. But once he got outside of that, he just didn't have the athleticism. When we were talking to him beforehand, PD said that he was like a PS1 controller. He didn't have the diagonals. It was just straight back, left, right. He didn't have anything else. But now, right, he has that full joystick. He can go any direction kind of at any time. And he's developed that throughout those 5 years. So when we talk about developmentally of how do you get a player from kind of that very kind of, segmented athleticism to a more robust athleticism, what does it start with?
I think of this as, 3 levels of problem. And I think that there's a natural feeling of looking at these really limited sort of blocky athletes is how I kind of describe them as guys that, you feel like their shoulders and hips are sort of attached by an invisible wire. They all sort of move at once, their whole body. You can't get them to sort of turn hips and shoulders in opposite directions at the same time, or at least it doesn't look that way when they play. So when looking at an athlete like this, the first thing that the first layer is flexibility and balance. And usually they have poor hip flexibility in my experience. Usually they have like poor spine or poor shoulders. It's just they appear as sort of one large muscle, not a series of connections. And then often that expresses itself as poor balance. So in a lot of those OG Indiana or OG rookie clips, you'll see he's kind of leaning over, or he's struggling to stop with his footing, which is incongruous with the amount of strength that he has, especially in his posterior chain. So that would be sort of level one. Level two is patterns and comfort. So when you don't have flexibility, when you don't have balance, it can be difficult to find rhythms. It can be difficult to find, basic two steps. And that middle pathway is just sort of getting into a place where you can do basic things well and you're comfortable with them. And then the third level, and I think this is where fans and development hope rests, is this highest tier of movement skills, which would be ideas like misdirection and tempo and creativity, which come from having all of the basics down. Like if you can't move multi-directionally, like creativity is not just limited, it's impossible. You go forward, you go backwards, you go left, you go right. You're extremely predictable. And when we watch OG now, defenders can't just sit on, okay, I'm going to go full speed or I'm going to stop. There is a real sense of apprehension of not knowing what he's going to do next, what element he's going to hit. And I think that if you had tried to get him to even replicate those moves as a second-year NBA player, it's not that they wouldn't work, it's they may not be possible. And while we want those things out of our ball handlers in development, it requires having a horizontal view of how they're going to develop and working slowly to get up to that point. You always want to start to work on the ideas of misdirection, start to work on the ideas of tempo while they're learning flexibility and balance. So there's not boredom or a loss of the overall goal. But to really hammer in on those as you get more available, more movement available, more freedom available, more options available. And that's what we've seen with OG. He's succeeded all those, and now we're seeing a new frontier of a player who can just do so many things that were extremely unlikely when he was 20 or 21.
Yeah, I know. And to add to each layer, from my expertise, that first aspect of, you talked about flexibility and balance. The term that we tend to use in medical is disassociation. Can your hips move in a disassociated pattern from, say, your shoulders, right? Are you able to control each of those things individually rather than everything being in that unit turn, which then leads to, like you said, the very kind of blocky movement chain. Can you break those things up in that regard, which leads to some of that flexibility? And flexibility, I don't think we just mean, people might think, oh, just muscle flexibility, I need to do stretches. That's not exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about more of torso rotation in different ways, right? Getting your body in different positions. Can my shoulders lean one way as my hips are going a different way? And those kinds of trunk flexion combined with hip flexion, those types, we're talking about real functional flexibility, just to clear that up. And then also the question becomes, is why wasn't OG able to do that before, right? Was it, let's say, a true mobility issue where he didn't have hip internal rotation, where he didn't have trunk flexion? Or was it just something where he wasn't comfortable with it because he wasn't ever doing it, right? Was it more neuromuscular? And so you just have to put the player in those positions in a specific way to get him more comfortable, right? And that's really where it comes down to that individual work with the player. We can't really speak to that because we're not doing the assessment on him. But that's some of the details that need to be parsed out. Because you see plenty of players with trainers where the trainer's like, oh, we're going to work on rotation, trunk rotation today. All right, cool. Does that actually carry over, right? Is that the actual underlying cause for why the player may or may not be able to do it? And then further, with certain players, it's, how do you hold them accountable when you're taking them through these movements? So let's say I want a player to a certain height with their trunk flexion, right? If I just tell them, I want you to be at this level, and they don't get there, how do they actually know what that level is? Because they never experienced it before, right? So you have to use certain cues. I love to use mirrors, or I love to use objects to give them a visual cue about kind of where I want them to get to. And so those type of things that I like to use to really give that feedback to the player. Because remember, you're teaching someone a completely foreign movement oftentimes, or completely foreign position that they're not going to be comfortable with. So just relying on them to do it through verbal feedback is not going to often help. And that, that leads to a whole different kind of topic on how to really lead to carryover for movement. But I just want to touch on that briefly. And then the second layer that you talked about with patterns, this goes back to something we talked about in our previous pod, which is, the route tree. How do you expand someone's route tree? Let's say OG only had 3 branches. He could only do 3 things, right? Now you are trying to expand that branch tree to give him that full, robust movement chain and movement variability. And I think something you see, we saw on the film, you can see on the clip, is that OG likes to use that initial kind of split step to get himself kind of into a rhythm and almost set himself up and prime his system for that, to choose his next movement. And to me, it's very similar to a player who, let's say, does a jump stop on their jumper or does a 2-step on their jumper. It's creating that rhythm that then allows him to be comfortable, as PD said, which then allows him to flow into that different system. Like with KD, he often uses that hezi as that priming of his system, which then allows him to move into his next movement chain. And so those are the types of things you can really try to give a player to make them feel comfortable prior to them then going into new movements. Because if a player does not feel comfortable, they are now going to be overtly thinking about their movements, which then inhibits their movement fluidity. We know from movement science, if you are overtly thinking about what you're doing, it's going to limit your fluidity, because that's not when you're doing a movement fluently, you're not thinking about it, you're just doing it. And so there's all these little things we can help teach with players, and that you see with OG that he's done and put into his game to help optimize that movement and variability. And then thirdly, like PD said, the last part, the creativity. I think a big thing that I see with that, as a player gets more comfortable, with moving in those different directions, stringing together certain movements, he now also gains a greater sample size and processing power of how to then counter off of it. And the more you do it, the slower the opponents, or the more clear the opponent's indicators become. So now he can read the opponent better now as well, right? So he's able to gain that advantage as well. So it's not just movement variability, now it's mental variability and being a step ahead in that regard. And that's why when you see a player with OG, it's so cool, because it's almost like exponential gains. One thing leads to another, and now he's just expanding this database constantly, and he's able to read defenders better as he becomes more and more comfortable within that massive, more robust kind of movement tree.
Yeah, you said something that really sticks out to me with this particular skill more than any skill, and that's against a defender. The way that we kind of laid this out, there's a philosophy that we kind of have in our program called TRL, which is teach, rep, live. And live doesn't always mean like straight basketball. It can mean like you have to, it's a skill where it is any drill where you have to, there is a understanding, like a defender is going to do something, you have to react. And, it could be a reaction drill. It could be, a 2-on-1 drill where you're trying to pick a side. It could be, a 3-on-2 to 2-on-1, but with some specific limitations. But it's trying to put that skill in a context where you have a reaction and you have to pick between options that we've worked on. So 2 or 3 options that we've just repped out, that we've taught, or, that we've really worked out. And now you're choosing, okay, what do I think is the best option? What feels the best for me? And I think that for a lot of, especially younger players, I think that OG is a perfect example of a player who did not grow up in the role that he plays now. Like him and Pascal are sort of the 2 different ideas of development, or 2 different philosophies of development happening at the same time. Pascal has always been in the role that Pascal is currently playing. When he went to New Mexico State, he was given a whole bunch of reps. He always had those insane movement skills, and just had this sort of shambling way of getting past people. It looks funny, but like when you try to guard it or when you put somebody near, it's like, I don't know how to stay in front of a 6'9" dude who moves like this. It's just like, you can feel it. You can think however the spin move looks, but like there's a lot of dudes who feel that way. And then they try to strap up and it does not work. And they're like, oh yeah, maybe I got to put some respect on that spin. But OG is the opposite. OG was always this cutter, this like, he had a small usage. He was never asked to, explore the studio space. And he's been given a bite size increase year over year. He's been given as much as he could handle, but never more. Some of that is roster development. Some of it is his draft spot. Some of that is the overall situation in Toronto. Some of it is just what he physically could handle. And I don't think that either is particularly, truthful or right or wrong. It's that there is an adaptation between the two of them. Like, yes, one's a second round pick, one's a first round pick. But the second round pick was always given more usage and more of a creation role. The first round pick was brought around slower. One, because he had a very clean role and you grew it out. And so I think that whatever teaching philosophy that a person has for this stuff, it's understanding that there has to be a game application for it as well. That, you always want someone to be able to develop creativity, but it may be a thing that takes 6 months, a year, 2 years, and scaling their expectations, scaling what they can handle. So you don't just say, okay, you're a point guard now. Drop you into the deep end. You have one move that we worked on for 30 minutes. Best of luck, kid. That can create negative feedback loops. So I think that it's not just what OG has learned, but it's what development can take from the different modalities that the Raptors have used for different guys, and that everyone needs a certain amount of tinkering for their philosophy, according to their skills, according to their situation, according to their players.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point that the Raptors have gradually built up that skill set for him, that movement tree variability, and not just that. Let's say they got to year 2 or 3, and let's say they weren't seeing the results that they wanted to, right? Maybe they wouldn't have let him keep going down this path. So that's another thing, right? You might have something in mind for a player, or if you're a young player, and to say, hey, maybe, I want to be this. But if you get to a certain point and you're not seeing those results, and you are training, with the correct manner, then maybe it's something that your nervous system or you're just not comfortable enough with, right, to be able to do that. Because not everyone can be that creative wing creator, right? Like that's just maybe it's not going to be for everybody. So, but I think that with the Raptors, they're using those objective indicators for them to dictate what pathway they took him down, right? And so if they didn't see the results they wanted, they probably would have diverted somewhere else. But he was able to use what they gave him. And they, like you said, they gave him a bigger morsel every year, and he kept developing. And he's now 5 years later at this, like you talked about early on, significantly, he said top quarter of the league in terms of unassisted plays across many kind of play types. And so it's a gradual process, but it's one that where if you work on it and you in the right manner and you're able to execute and give the player the right tools, it can really unlock that fluidity. Because I often hear about this, and I think the reason we wanted to do this podcast is that you often hear about kind of fluidity as being binary, whether you got it or you don't, right? And that's just not true. You can build some of these things into players if you understand the underlying components of fluidity. Like fluidity to me is a superficial, kind of going back to, what our cover art is with the tip of the iceberg. Fluidity to me is a tip of the iceberg. It's not, it's a symptom of many other things underneath it. And if you can deconstruct those things and give the player some of those components that they're lacking, or at least, try to teach them, like I said, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, then it can lead to fluidity in multiple different areas. And it's something that becomes this self-reinforcing cycle. And it's great to watch players kind of gain that because it unlocks so much for them. And then that confidence shoots up and then like you watch OG play now, it's almost like he doesn't think that anyone can guard him off the dribble. And that's the beauty of all of it.
Yeah. And I mean, I started smiling because you hit on a great phrase, which is like, if it doesn't work, this is going to make him a better defender. So like, exactly what are you losing by spending a little extra time, giving him a little extra creativity? It's like, yeah, more trunk flexibility is going to help him, get around screens better.
Yeah.
So I think that if you were to grab, your average 21-year-old very good defender who's a little bit, connected in the shoulders and hips, be like, would you rather work on flexibility and then fighting over screens, or we can do some weird, very big, very loopy dribbling moves? They're going to do roughly the same thing. Which one would be more enjoyable? I think every single kid is going to be like, yeah, I'll take the dribbling. That sounds fun. Like, and it'll get you to the same point because you're working on the same ideas, but it's that level of embracing that challenge of being like, okay, let's add a little bit. And say OG never really developed as a creator, there would still be that confidence of knowing that he went down a unique path. And maybe it's only, it pops up once a game or once every other game, but that's still a huge development that it pays dividends in other areas because movement skills are universal. We just think of them as segmented because that's the way that our brains pull these things out. So I'm just here to give you the biggest platform possible, Doc. I would love to hear you get as deep as you feel is best for what are the component pieces that make up this fluidity. How do these biomechanical processes, like what is the changes that you see from 21-year-old to 25-year-old OG? Like how does a guy go from moving like he's made out of extremely explosive cardboard, but struggles on a diagonal plane, to a guy who's able to sauce up primary defenders in the league? Like, what does that change?
Yeah, and the biggest change that I see is really from a neuromuscular standpoint, in that when you first used to watch him play when he was younger, right, 21-year-old, let's say, he was only comfortable in certain positions, obviously, so he stayed in those positions, right? And whenever he got out of them, it's almost like his body shut down. They just wouldn't do it because his brain was like, nope, not doing it. And so what happens a lot of times, what we see with players who aren't fluid, it's because from a neurological standpoint, their brain's just not comfortable with that movement. So it's not going to do it. And so a lot of times we'll attribute like, oh, the person doesn't have the right torso rotation or hip mobility. But I could manually test someone's hip mobility and it could be great. But when I take them into a functional play and they don't have it, that's not a lack of hip internal rotation. That's a lack of their brain and body not being comfortable with that specific context, right? And so that's what we talk about when you're really giving OG a platform for all his movements. It's giving him that neuromuscular comfort where his brain isn't interpreting movements as dangerous. What happens, let's say, when you're in pain? Let's say you have shoulder pain. What's going to happen? Your brain's going to say it's dangerous. What's it going to do? It's going to start guarding with all its muscles around it. What does that limit? It limits movement. Now let's apply that to OG Anunoby, not pain-based. Let's say his brain is only used to straight line movements. When he tries to go, cross over laterally, what's his brain going to say? Oh, hey, this is weird. That's dangerous. What's it going to do? It's going to tense everything up, right? And so all his muscles now start guarding. So what's that lead to? Oh, hey, this guy's not fluid. No, what is it really? His brain is just not used to these positions. And so that's how you have to start incorporating these movements for him or any player, right? Get them first into this position of safety and comfort where you can do some of these movements in a non-stressful, non-judgmental setting, right? A learning setting, rather than trying to do it, in a competitive setting only, because right away you're going to be stressed out, whatever it is, right? That's going to then entangle with what the brain already tells them is dangerous. So you want to make a safe setting for them to use this in. And then also, I think you want to frame it in a manner that's not threatening to them, that's saying, oh, you just can't do it, or, hey, you don't have the mobility. That becomes very binary. Rather than painting it in more of a softer manner, we are saying, hey, you just can't, you're not able to do this right now because we haven't worked on it. Something like that, where it's not a permanent fixture versus something that's more malleable. And so that's kind of what I really, really see with some of these players, is that they get into this loop where they're not comfortable with something, they don't understand why, they get told that they're not good at it, so they don't do it. And that reinforces that vicious cycle in their neuromuscular and their brain system and saying, hey, don't do that. Leads to a ton of muscle guarding, leads to a ton of, quote, immobility. And so that's why you have to make players comfortable in their own bodies, right? The guys you see moving really, really well at weird angles, like Steph Curry, for example, right, has a significant fluidity in the way he moves now, at least, is that you see a comfort level with their movement that you don't see in many other players, right? To me, that's a very robust nervous system when I see these guys move, or with OG now. And so I think if we can really focus on those aspects without putting labels on players, it allows them to then explore those movements without feeling uncomfortable about them or feeling judged about them. And that applies, to all movement, regardless of whether it's OG or if it's anyone else, right? It's exploring, like you said, PD, that space that you have, movement space. And we know with movement, that exploration, that failure is what feeds the nervous system. And so it allows people to then get comfortable. And, as a coach, as a trainer, you have to guide the player to be okay with that discomfort and make them understand why they have it, rather than just saying, a binary, oh, you just can't do it, or whatever it is, right? Which does not help anything. And I think one last thing, I know we're going out for a little bit here, but is giving these players some of those tools to help them kind of unlock that comfort and that rhythm, like we talked about with OG, right? He likes to do that split step. Let them, if you notice a player, let's say on their shot, they like to do a certain foot pattern, right? If they're comfortable with that, why not let them do something similar on their dribble, just because their nervous system is already comfortable with it, right? Unless, of course, it's something, crazy that's just going to inhibit them completely. Why not allow them to already use the tool that their body's already comfortable with to help expedite that movement variability, right? If they're already very comfortable with that on their jump shot, it's likely that's going to translate over to other movements as well.
Translation is the hardest thing in all of this, and translation works in a lot of different directions. Like I've had kids that are bigs, and there's a drill that I like where you pretend that you're dribbling the basketball. You just say, hey, for 15 seconds, be as creative as you can, pretending that you're dribbling. Mm-hmm. Any move you can think of, try. And you'll see the big kids, like big hang dribbles, just like multiple rips. Like suddenly they got a lot. And then you hand them the ball and they don't try any of that. Like it's not even can they do it? It's that they've internalized that when basketball, I don't try shamrocks. I don't try between spins. And it's not that they couldn't do that. It's that they've conditioned themselves out of that movement pattern. And that they've been like, well, if I try that, bad things could happen. And so by getting outside of the comfort zone, or even like the judgment zone of what they, in a game, this will lead this way. Or like I see a lot of guys uncomfortable with footwork because they think it'll lead to like them getting, their shot blocked or whatever. But if you can train that footwork, I think this is why a lot of people like ladders, even though I have, there's concerns about ladders transferring because of, once you get past a certain level of competence, and there not being an immersive quality to the ladders. But the ladders are not a relationship that players generally have. They don't think of the ladder as in the game. So if you can get them outside of their comfort zone, quite often in things they don't recognize as the footwork that you're actually working on, sort of a backdoor, sneaky outside of like, okay, now I can be in a creative space. I think that suddenly leads to transfer, because the ball does slow people down, because we have relationships to movements, whether they be emotional or physical or whatever, that do slow us down. And that getting outside of that does have values, and it does require a creativity and a bravery from coaches to do things that are a little bit weird to get unusual results. Because at the end of the day, like, this is an unusual result. Whatever the Raptors have some ideas on what they've done, but like, this is a 90th, 95th 99th percentile outcome for a 6'8" person to move this way after the way that they moved 5, 7, 10 years ago, including an ACL injury, which like we haven't quite touched on, but like does, bear a huge mention. So, I mean, I think that, we've touched on some wonderful things. I just want to say thank you so much for letting me talk about this.
Yeah, and then one last thing I wanted to touch on to your point about variability is that's why you see multi-sport athletes tend to have more movement robustness, because they're involved in different sports where within each sport there's more acceptance of a certain movement pattern. So when you combine all those movement patterns, right, you have a guy with much more movement that's much more robust within each sport as well. Or it doesn't feel weird to them, or whatever it is, right?
Or they're more comfortable in the weirdness.
Yeah, exactly.
Like they've had to learn 5 or 6 different independent movement patterns, keep track of them. So learning a new movement pattern to them is not like, I mean, a lot of times with basketball players, they have a set. I mean, if you've been a basketball player and basketball player only, you have a set movement pattern. That's what you do. You move a certain way. It can be really difficult to get them out of that. But if you've been a tennis player and a football player, and you were playing 2 positions in football, and you also played a little bit of volleyball, like you've had somebody be like, okay, so we move this way. You had to learn how to learn new things, learn how to learn new patterns. And until, coaches get comfortable teaching those new patterns, teaching that discomfort, teaching an enjoyment of that discomfort, I think that we will have, some of the lower percentile outcomes, because people are trying to comfort their way into these problems.
Yeah, and then that goes for anything, whether it's basketball or anything else. The brain loves homeostasis, right? Whenever you try to change anything, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? You become uncomfortable. It could be you could be like, let's say you could be the crappiest eater in the world, just eat, like people I've seen eating, Krispy Kreme, and you could change that to a very healthy diet, right? Which objectively is a great move. But that person is going to feel very, very uncomfortable doing that, because their set point is eating that crappy food. So that change, the brain is, why are you doing this, right? It's going to feel uncomfortable, even if the end product is going to be a much healthier person. So I always try to say, hey, change is always going to be uncomfortable. It doesn't matter what direction you're moving in. That's just how the human brain works. It likes stability. It likes homeostasis. And so we have to embrace that change and that discomfort of it. And the Raptors, with OG, credit to him, credit to their staff, have done that tremendously. And I think that'll take us out for this week. And as always, we appreciate you joining us. PD, where can they find you? Let us know any projects you got going on, and then I'll take us out of here.
You can find me on Twitter at Above the Break 3. I do my writing on Patreon, where the work is free, and I have a number of. I should have both a large shooting piece and a large section on drills, which include a whole bunch of movement drills, which we have talked about for a while now. Coming out this week. Thank you for having me. This is a ton of fun. This is a real highlight of my week.
No, man, awesome. I know you just released something new, some new writing on Patreon, so definitely check that out for any listeners out there. For myself, you can find me YouTube, Patreon as well, of course on Twitter at 3CB, 3 Charlie Beta Performance. And thanks for listening, and we'll catch y'all next time.